Star rises, the sky wonders, and earth trembles. A gathering of spirits y abuelitas, making room for one more sun coming home. The bright light shine of crossover, traveling in between worlds of living and dying. The strength in willing more time to let go. Rolling homemade flour tortillas by the dozen, a giveaway in love beads and dusting flour. Hands rubbing skin before last time to remember how strong a word can be shared. Rising star shaking earth, the dampened comfort of December. Forest stands still, sacred buffalo pause, coyote stare, hold, white wolf woven in soul warmers. The portal of reawakening consciousness, the last road trip to ever be taken. Ocean waves slow retreating, cedar scenting, plant air, staying warm by crackling fires, offering wood gratitude. The sound of ancestors in flute calling song, soothing lifetime wounds, rolling words in poetry, felt out feelings in blueberries and maple tasting. Last breaths feeling lightweight in incredible pureness, weightlessness sought since birth. Rain misting, orange pills forgiving, smoke signals, sweetened grass and juniper, copal turning, softened heart rocks. Poets hoed gently when held in understanding all the misunderstood, only understood together. When a star rises and love wins. Thank you for hearing my words. My name is Tara Trudel, and I'm a poet and visual artist, and I am a student at New Mexico Highlands University in Las Vegas, New Mexico. I am also, or was also, an AmeriCorps intern with the AmeriCorps Cultural Technology Program at Highlands. And I am honored to be here at MCM, whose theme this year is the human-centered museums. Because this relates importantly to our project of taking this poem you just heard and creating an organic, humanistic, multisensory experience, which we're going to talk about this morning.
Thank you, Tara. The image on the screen is from the video where Tara is reading her poem, moving each bead, coinciding with words. In the lower left is our ASL interpreter, Carol Litherland. And my name is Lauren Addario. I'm the director of the AmeriCorps Cultural Technology Program at New Mexico Highlands University. I teach a class as part of this program. And last year we had a year-long focus on accessibility that started in the fall semester of 2015. Coincidentally and simultaneously, MCN also had a focus on accessibility in 2015. I could not be here, but I could access all the information online in real time. I was able to listen to the Ignite presentations, I was able to follow Twitter, and because I could follow the discussion threads, I was able to bring this timely discussion into my classroom in real time in rural northern New Mexico. Lesley came and spoke to our class. Actually, she first Skyped in the fall semester. She spoke about multisensory learning and paying attention to smell, to taste, to texture, and to sound. And the outcome of the class during the fall semester was that the students wanted to create their own multisensory experience, and we chose Tara's poem as the medium.
My name is Lesley Kadish. I'm a researcher at Georgetown University's Technology Design Studio in their Communications, Culture, and Technology department. And I was a co-lead on the Pilgrimage project when I met Lauren and Tara. And little did we know that we had begun a similar journey. Mine in urban DC, and theirs in rural northern New Mexico. So, as reflective journeys, pilgrimages arise in most faith traditions, with destinations from Mecca to Varanasi to Jerusalem. And our project, the Pilgrimage Project, took its name from these practices because we sought to cultivate a spirit of contemplation on Georgetown campus. So in the spirit of pilgrimage, over 60 students from 4 different departments journeyed for 1 year to a common location with this goal of making visible hidden aspects of Georgetown's history, heritage, architecture, and environment. This location was explored through historical, creative, and experiential methods. We created an archive, and then this archive was enacted in a series of artistic digital projects, culminating in an interactive and multisensory installation event. So in other words, we had this 225-year-old building on campus that has hosted the heavy hitters from Obama to Washington to Lincoln. But right now it's this functional university office space where once it was these great rooms with a view of the Potomac, and now there are these subdivided cubicle nooks with a campus built up around it. So with 2 centuries of life there, we asked ourselves, how can we create an exhibition that allows these layers of the space to be brought forth and allows the students, the people that are passing through on a daily basis, to understand that their experience there, the 6 minutes that they've been there passing through, are just as important as the 200 years of history that were there before. So this is really an opportunity for the 3 of us to have a discussion. And even though this is a very funny physical format, we're doing this in a way because we have genuine questions for each other. So I'm going to start by asking these 2 a question, because I was far away from you guys when you began this process. So my question is, how did this process get started, your development of this multisensory exhibition?
I can start with that. It started when we did, so one of the things that we do as AmeriCorps Media Cultural Technology interns, and we are the only department in the United States that deals with a lot of exhibits that we go into museums and we study accessibility, like Lauren touched on, through AmeriCorps. And so it started with when I think Lauren shared a video presentation of a poem being read in one of the museums, or it was done with script text. And as a poet, I was a little appalled at how monotone that poem was being delivered. That was the first seed. And then we met Lesley through a Skype presentation, and I was fascinated by her work. And so being interns, we work for other people, but we are also artists, or we have these talents that we bring to the table. So it started in the fall of 2015, and during the time that Lesley did her presentation for our class, my dad had been given 6 to 10 weeks. So I was dealing with that, and as an artist, I process my work through poetry and through words. So during the last week in November into the first week in December, I went and spent the last week of my dad's life with him, and I process things very emotionally and sensitive to my environment. So after he passed, I wrote this poem. And then I took this poem back to Lauren when school started and said, what can we do with this? And I looked around at my peers in the classroom and realized they were not all artists, but they're extremely talented interns, whether it was multimedia or graphic design. And then Lauren took that question that I had, and she posted the poem on our Facebook page, and we asked the students to pick verses, and how could we tie it into what Lesley had brought to us about texture, about scent, about all these different senses that we have. And that I feel the faster we move through technology and digital age, and it's great that we do all these virtual reality things, there's nothing more important than getting back to the organic, humanistic way of experiencing emotions, even in museums and galleries. So that's how that process started, and Lauren might want to add a few more to that. Okay.
I think you pretty much said it. Just that we wanted to create a multisensory exhibit, and so I posted Tara's poem to our group Facebook page, and it gave the students a chance to read the poem, to reflect on it, and to think about how to interpret Tara's very poignant words into a sensory experience.
So, like, here you have this poem, which is, you know, in some ways the essence of a time in your life. And when I hear you talk about it, and I hear, if I may say what you told us yesterday, that in the last week of her father's life, he couldn't eat, but he could smell. And so she cooked for him, she broke apart oranges, she smashed blueberries, and that the sensory experience that was so wed with that poem was the main struggle for the students. Okay, how are we going to take that, the sensory, the life of that, and in an exhibition sort of re-invive that? So my next question is, what sort of things did the students do to re-invive this poem, or as you say, to take it off the page?
I can probably answer that too. Well, first of all, remember that we have no budget. And when I say that I took the poem to Lauren, what I do as a visual artist is I type my poetry into beads. So I type them word for word. This is what you see here. It's from a still from a video. So I read the beads. So I took this 20, maybe 5-foot long strand of beads and said, here we go. What do we do with this? Because I as an artist and as a poet, I like to take the word off the page and create something that's tangible that we can touch, and allow the viewer or the participant a different experience, a sensory experience. So going to my peers, I said, okay, what can we do? What with accessibility in mind, what can we do? How can we appeal to somebody who may not be able to hear, may not be able to see, that is in a wheelchair? How can we provide them a sensory experience? And so we had a graphic designer who took the poem and created these amazing visuals just out of words. And so the poem I read to you was basically me capturing the last week that I spent with my dad. So he created the visuals that we wheat pasted. He also took all the words that apply to our senses, words I didn't even think of, and created hands that were touching. And these were about 6 feet by 4 feet. We had another, so sometimes with interns and as artists, we don't feel like we're artists. So we had some interns who did not feel that they were artists, but they were able to offer multimedia technology skills. So we had video work. We created a soundscape, which is part of this video, the still that you see here, with layers of sound. We had a young woman who was an intern, Felicia, who created Braille, took different verses of the poem and created these Braille art pieces that you could touch. We wanted people to come into the space and touch things and feel things and smell dirt and pick up sage and smell these things, because we're not allowed to do that in many public places. So that was how we really engaged the students. And like I said, we had no budget and we had limited space. So it was a very creative process and one that really took off.
But you guys, this thing was amazing, really. But, you know, I went to visit them when the space that was going to be the exhibition space was basically this sort of like brutalist student center. You know, if you can imagine, like terrible lighting, really high ceilings, terrible acoustics. And then you had to transform this as well as these other spaces. So how did you deal with the constraints of the space when you needed to make an experience that I'm going to guess needed to be very intimate, if nothing else?
I can start by speaking to that because I worked for many years in this building. Thankfully, we have a new building now. But this was like Lesley said, an old student center built in the early 60s, I think, maybe late 50s. And I'm just going to describe the space for you for a minute. Imagine a space with no windows, with acoustic tile on the ceiling, gray carpet, very kind of bright fluorescent lighting, oftentimes getting very warm because there was no ventilation. So this was the kind of space we were dealing with, yet we wanted to transform this space and really turn it into a multisensory experience, yet the only thing that you could really sense when you were in there was oftentimes how still and hot the air was. But I think the very first thing we talked about was addressing the lighting and trying to figure out how to control the lighting in such a way so that people would feel it was an intimate space rather than a claustrophobic kind of space. So we controlled the lighting. We also worked with the exhibit design to control the traffic flow so that while you can't predict how people are going to move through a space, we set it up so that the primary information about the exhibit was in the center of the room, and people would walk around the room to access the different aspects of the exhibit. The next thing we did was control the sound, and the audio was primarily Tara reading her poem, but also we added audio layers. So we added layers of information in terms of ocean sounds and fire crackling and somebody cooking tortillas and
coyotes howling.
And coyotes howling. All of the things that you hear happening in the poem were then added to an audio soundtrack that played kind of just behind Tara reading her words. We also controlled the space with smell. We had some of the students pick certain parts of the poem, and there's one section of the poem where Tara talks about peeling oranges, and so we had one student grate oranges, and we put steam, a humidifier, and had them really kind of permeating the air. So we then, it created a wonderful smell, if you like oranges, as you walked into the room. We did the same thing with sage. We couldn't burn the sage, but we did burn it and then bring the sage into the space after. So those were some of the ways that we addressed transforming that very, I would say, bland space into something of a multisensory experience in and of itself.
And I think it's important to note that this was a student-led exhibit or experience. So there needs to be one person in that group that sees it before it happens. So I was that person. So you kind of have to say, this is what I see. This is how it's going to be. And they have to trust you in making that happen. And that's pretty much what did end up happening, because I know there was a lot of doubt sometimes, like, is she crazy? How are we going to pull this off? But when we're all on the same page, that's when the synchronicity of art is at its best, and we were able to make this happen. And like Lauren said, it's a small space, and whether it was a small or a large space, it was very important to be wheelchair accessible, so we made sure to make sure everything was measured.
Well, to the point that it being a student-driven project, I want to also have an opportunity to ask, and maybe, Lauren, you can answer this in 2 bullet points, since we have to move on. What would you say were the 2 takeaways?
Lighting is important, signage is important, and having enough space for people to move around is important.
We're not done.
So I have a lot of questions for Lesley as well, but I've pared them down to 4. And my first question is, can you please tell me about your archive?
Right, okay, so remember I said that we have this massive building, and then we had all of these students working to develop an archive about this historic building. It's a single historic building. It's called Old North. And each one of I think Allie's going to close the door. Each one of these classes, we had English department, we had art history, we had communications, culture, technology, and in the communications, culture, technology, we had videographers, we had a remix class. So every single one of these classes looked at the same building, and they did their critical research from their disciplinary perspective. So the art historians, for example, we had 4 paintings in there. I'm not going to remember the Henry Mosler. How about that? Henry Mosler's paintings of the colonial America. And they did art historical research into them, including one of them that disappeared in the 1968 riots. So they did investigatory research. But one of the most interesting parts of this archive that we developed was that it wasn't just information. It wasn't just like, okay, we want information about this building. It was that, remember I said this is like a pilgrimage. So what we did was we decided that the students would choose a spot in this building to revisit once a week for the entire year. And when they went there, they would do something related to their research. So for example, the English class wrote a haiku from the same spot every week for a year. And we weren't just interested in sort of, the fact that the haikus may change. We were also interested in how the metadata itself would change around that. And so we were very careful to also archive and create sensory metadata. So for example, they didn't just write the haiku, they also had to record at that point, what was the weather? What did their body feel like? What was their mood in before they wrote it? What was their mood out after they wrote it? What was the exact time, and again, what location were they at? So that at the end of this year, when we had our archive, we didn't just have the archive of, again, the facts and then again the poems, but we also had this growing archive that in aggregation could tell lots of different stories about how the weather would affect people's bodies, what their moods were in and out, etc. Next question.
So this kind of begs the question, you have all of this data. What was your medium for?
This was a tough one, right? Because you always have that question when you start any project that you need a digital archive. Do you build your own, or do you use something out of the box? So what we decided to do, actually, because we were in DC, was to use Omeka. And I say because we were in DC, George Mason is where Omeka is from, and we could ask them questions. So we decided to use Omeka. Can I see a show of hands who's not familiar with Omeka? Okay. Not enough of you for me to explain it. Google it. But basically, it's an online system for being able to upload both collections and information about collections, and then if you want to create online exhibits on the fly based on this. And there's APIs that et cetera. So what we struggled with most was the fact that, okay, here we have all this information, this archive, but different disciplines, and so we had to think, what metadata are we going to use that will cross the disciplines? So we decided to use Dublin Core, maybe expectedly, but then we also created item-specific metadata that related to our sensory information, and that was sort of the richest part of this, was deciding what the sensory metadata would be that would be collected for the year, and how we would parse it.
So what kinds of projects were created from this information? Because I'm very curious to hear about that.
Okay, so this was like the coolest, most radical thing. Like I said, we had 60 students who were working from the same archive, if you can imagine that. It's kind of like all of us walk into this room and we're all having very different experiences of the same room, even though we're all facing the same direction. So the students, we decided that even though we had a full year of creating this archive, it was only like 8 hours that we took over this historic building. And so, we tend to focus on that, but I'm going to tell you about some things that manifested in those 8 hours with that archive. So, one student looked at these paintings. This was an art history student, and they analyzed the colors in the paintings, and then the visual spectrum of those paintings were mapped to notes on a musical scale, and then the relative presence of the colors informed a musical composition. Right? And so you listen to this ambient music that was the painting speaking back to you. Another student developed scents and put them in little boxes next to it so that you could smell while you watched, and you got to choose which smell you thought best sort of captured the feel of that painting. Another student programmed a robot, given all of that information, to give history tours, so you could follow this little robot moving around. But one of my favorites I want to tell you about was that one student she was really interested in evaluation. She was really interested in capturing formative, summative data. And we were like, okay, well, how are you going to do that? So this is what she did. She had her friends pose as travel agents. And they would greet all the visitors in character when they would come in, and they would ask certain questions, kind of similar to the ones that were asked of the students who were writing the haikus. Hey, describe the weather out there. What are you expecting to get out of this visit? How do you feel right now? And then she would give them a little number. So that she said, come back with this number when you leave. So there's a little table, and there the travel agents are. They've taken all the information, and throughout the exhibition, they're sitting there, properly typing it up as a travel agent would. And then you come back, you give them their number. They ask you some other questions, thickly veiled summative evaluation questions that, again, were, how do you feel? What's the weather like? How did it meet your expectations, etc. So it's entered in. Well, a script was written by this woman to basically mash up everybody's responses from that 8 hours so that it put it back out in a little haiku poem. And so it was printed out, this lovely little piece of paper that was a haiku. So you got yourself a haiku. So in reflection of the haikus that were created throughout, you walked away with a haiku.
So what were some of the takeaways?
We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to give you these takeaways in words, individual words. The first word is ephemerality, as in sensory exhibitions tend to be like pop-ups that get taken down before you can really steep in them. So if you do a sensory exhibition or you work with a sensory exhibition, really give it time to actually be up, time for people to be in it. Second word, accessibility, as in, yes, physical, but also spiritual and emotional accessibility. So oftentimes these exhibitions deal with things that you need the time and the space, which speaks to my third word, which is speed. There are different requirements for the pace and the way people move through multisensory exhibitions. And then the final word next to final word is natural. As I was realizing as you guys were talking, how many natural elements were part of your exhibition. And I think how that helped really to evoke things, and that when we deal with the natural elements, there is a natural way that it touches us and ties to our body. And that the exhibition that I worked on in the year of work that I worked on really kept a sort of highly intellectual piece to it. So things like the fundamentals of water, smoke, wind impact us in different ways than just ideas and text and visual do. And finally, vulnerability, as in when we ask our visitors to be vulnerable, especially when we're dealing with these issues of life, death, what do we need to bring of our own vulnerability? And what is lost when an exhibition becomes more of a performance than a conversation? So on that, it's noon, high noon. And thank you very much.